Welcome back, fellow Space Marines, to another rage-rarin' and rippin'-tearin' episode of What Happened, the YouTube-style pop culture media show that digs its fists deep into the huge guts of the movie and video game industries. And this week, since we've now officially entered the Dark Ages, it seems as good a time as any to take a look back at the development of one of the most unique entries in the legendary Doom franchise that didn't start off quite as you'd expect, didn't realize its full potential that the dev team had for it, and took over 20 years for many fans to finally gain an appreciation for. So, grab your double chainsaws and unmakers as I answer the question, what happened to Doom 64? Now, you can't chart the development of this
Ultra 64
title without going back to where it all began, Wolfenstein 3D for the SNES. Yes, as bizarre as it may seem, our story begins with one of the most infamous ports in first-person shooter history, which has its own, very what-happened-y development story. In a 2020 article, Shacknews detailed how this particular version came to be, and it all started when Japanese publisher Imagineer hit up id Software to bring the explosive adventures of BJ Blazkowicz to Nintendo's 16-bit console. They, of course, were happy to do such, but you see, id had a problem. They were knee-deep in the dead on the development of the original Doom, and none of its main staff, Carmack, Romero, Hall, etc., had the time or even the know-how to program for the SNES. It made sense then that they contracted an outside developer that did, assigned him the task, and got back to focusing on their top priority, which of course was fighting demons on the moons of Mars. Months passed, and eventually Imagineer came a-callin' to ask if Wolfenstein was ready to go, to which id said,
"Oh crap, I forgot!"
So they quickly got on the phone to get an update from the unnamed third-party developer. Turns out, he had become seriously ill and hadn't made any significant progress at all, so id then had to set Doom aside for a few weeks and learn the ins and outs of the SNES in record time, so they could get Wolfenstein out the door to make the release date set by Imagineer. What id also didn't account for was Nintendo's strict guidelines for violent content, as this was before the formation of the ESRB, which would result in several cuts and changes, with the most significant of these being the removal of the, everything that clearly identified Wolfenstein as a World War II conflict. Unfortunately though, with the release date fast looming and no time to argue, id just had to acquiesce. So suffice it to say, nobody had a great time working on this port, as it very much became a chapter of id history that they just probably wanted to put behind them. This is bolstered by the fact that in the Shacknews article, Jay Wilbur, who is the head of id's business development back then, stated the following. The result of the experience at that time was us opting not to do another game with Nintendo while these policies were in place. Something I told Nintendo of America counsel Howard Lincoln personally as I recounted our frustration on the development process. And it might very well have remained as such. That is, until early 1994, where id received another unlikely call from another unlikely source, that being Williams Entertainment Inc., who would, just a few years later, change their name to perennial What Happened All-Star Midway Games, which I'll be referring to from now on. The call itself came from Brian Cook, formerly a TradeWest co-founder, who proposed that Midway should have the exclusive publishing rights for id's PC output on consoles, which, is a pretty sound business decision. id, for their part, were pretty positive about the deal, as compared to other publishing partners they had previously dealt with, respected the Williams/Midway name for the various arcade hits, most notably Mortal Kombat, making the partnership even more attractive. One of Midway's first directives, however, was a far-fetched one. See, they, along with various other Western studios at the time, had caught wind of the next big machine that was set to change the industry, a cutting-edge 3D polygon-pushing powerhouse that could definitely provide a good home for id's landmark sci-fi horror FPS. It made perfect business sense, so all Midway had to do was convince id Software to support the very same platform holder that they had swore off from ever working with again. As you can imagine, id were hesitant about working with Nintendo once more, but like Jay Wilbur had said, they were initially against the idea as long as Nintendo still had their content policies in place, which in 1994 they no longer did, as the ESRB had taken over those duties. So Doom was ported to the SNES, which, as we know, had its fair share of issues, but it was still an astounding technical achievement nonetheless. But, as we've covered in the past, Nintendo's then upcoming
Ultra 64
received a pretty significant delay, from 1995 to late 1996, which naturally meant that the development of a new Doom game was farther off than Midway had originally estimated. So, with Nintendo feverishly working away in secret, an alternative plan was hatched, which inadvertently resulted in a notable and impressive version of Doom for Nintendo's biggest competitor. Brian Cook suggested that they instead make Doom for Sony's PlayStation in the meantime, which obviously was better than just twiddling their thumbs waiting for Nintendo. In the Shack News article, Aaron Sealer, the programmer for both PlayStation Doom and Doom 64, recounted, "The PSX version was a 2-for-1 byproduct of the N64 deal, and served as a base for all the research and development tech and tools we would need to bring up for the N64, which was not anywhere close to specs or silicon. All the N64's capabilities were wild guessing." So, with a plan in place, Aaron Sealer moved into an office at id just down the hallway from John Carmack and learned everything he could about what made the Doom engine tick, direct from the boyish, bespectacled, omnipresent void of eldritch knowledge that had originally coded it. Of course, lots of changes had to be made to get Doom up and running on the PlayStation, but it also saw plenty of new benefits: colored lighting effects, animated skyboxes, and a whole new soundscape. As some may know, Bobby Prince, the composer of Doom 1 and 2, retained the rights to the iconic music he had created, which meant if any future compositions were to be based on his tracks, he would need to be compensated, and that wasn't gonna work for Midway, brother. Instead, new hire Aubrey Hodges was assigned to the job, with the mandate that the music for this new version of Doom had to sound distinctly different. Hodges therefore leaned into more of an industrial horror direction, which changed the vibe significantly, and along with the new colored lighting effects, gave this PlayStation version its own unique feel. So, when Doom arrived on Sony's console in late 1995, it was met with positive reviews, with id themselves being very pleased with the results that the Midway team had achieved. And while magazine outlets appreciated the slightly new look and very different but incredibly atmospheric music, at the end of the day, it still played largely the same, having no new weapons, monsters, or gameplay innovations over the original, which at the time of this port's release was already 2 years old. Aaron Sealer was very satisfied with the final product as well, as it was not only a great conversion, it provided a ton of valuable experience for the upcoming work he would have to take on to do the same for the Nintendo 64. Now, while the specs for the machine were reportedly greatly reduced from what Nintendo had first started telling developers a year earlier, Sealer felt they were more than adequate, and has gone on record saying, outside of storage space issues, it was easier to program for overall. But the team at Midway and the higher-ups in the company didn't just want to remake or port Doom 1 or 2 again. The idea was to create a wholly unique chapter that would provide fans with an all-new experience. This also marks the first instance where both Midway and id started to clash a little bit, as the Doom 64 team were keen to push things into unfamiliar territory, which would certainly make for a fresh approach. Id, however, were uncomfortable with this, and kept telling Midway it needed to be more in line with what had come before, so those grander ambitions kept getting scaled back into something more familiar. Aaron Sealer even commented on this in a pre-release interview in the March 1997 issue of the official Nintendo UK magazine, saying, "Id wanted us to be true to what Doom was. Originally, we had a lot of different ideas about taking Doom in a different direction, and they were like, no, Doom is like this, don't mess with the equation too much." We went off on this sort of a minor false tangent. We thought we'd add different types of architectural elements because we wanted to exploit the N64, but they were like, cool, but that's not really Doom. Id were very particular about their game, which I understand perfectly, but we were allowed to experiment with some areas of the game, and at that point they basically said, okay, you guys are on track, keep going in this direction and it'll come out really well. Some of this information is what may have led to the rumor that Doom 64 wasn't even originally intended to be a Doom game at all, but rather an unrelated FPS simply called the Absolution. From all my research, however, this seems to be more of a Purple Monkey dishwater situation, as internally the game was known as Project Absolution, which is a very common practice where publishers want to keep the existence of a certain game a secret. So just to clear the air, this was always supposed to be Doom. I mean, that's why William/Midway even contacted it in the first place, to make a new
Doom!
for Nintendo's then upcoming console. Related but unrelated though, there was a issue with the game's final name. In the Shack News article, it was revealed that all the parties involved, id, Midway, and Nintendo, had to go back and forth several times to land on the title that would appear on the game's box art. Even though it had always been planned as a sequel or spin-off of sorts, id would not allow this project to be called Doom 3, as the marketing power of a numbered sequel was something they wanted to keep for themselves. They also insisted that excluding the name Doom was non-negotiable, as it was obviously central to the brand, so that meant calling it Absolution or Resurrection or anything else wasn't going to fly. Nintendo, however, was against simply just calling it Doom, as they felt every game had to have some sort of subtitle to differentiate it from all the other ports. But nobody wanted players to think that this was just a basic conversion of the original PC game either, because it very much wasn't. But without any other options or better suggestions, everyone just kinda threw up their hands and settled on Doom 64. This, of course, would go on to have its own drawbacks, because outside of Nintendo franchises that did use the 64 suffix, it meant that some gamers would eventually lump this Doom together with the likes of Duke Nukem 64 or Carmageddon 64. Now, if you'll allow me to circle strafe back over to the technical side, while Aaron Sealer and the rest of the team enjoyed working on Nintendo's polygonal-based console for the most part, they did bemoan the lack of storage space on N64 cartridges, as at this early juncture, only 64 megabits or 8 megs were available to work with. This meant several OG monsters, bosses, and weapon animation frames needed to be cut. But they did make up for this somewhat by introducing an all-new weapon, the Unmaker, as well as the Nightmare Imp, which itself was cut from PlayStation Doom, and finally, the new end boss, the mother of all demons. Most regrettable of all, though, was the loss of any sort of multiplayer mode. Even though the game's famous intro screen seems to hint at multiple Marines taking on demons in a hectic battle royale-style slaughterfest, it simply wasn't something the team could do at the time, and to be fair, aside from Mario Kart, the N64 hadn't really established itself yet as a multiplayer-centric console at that time. Midway did try and attempt to cope over this inability to include split screen though, saying in that same Nintendo UK interview, "There's no deathmatch. If it couldn't be done right, there was no point to it. Multiplayer is a neat thing to see for about 5 minutes, then it's just like, yeah, it works for other games, but not for Doom." Now put down your chainsaws, rabid fans, as it should be noted that Aaron Seeler was responding to Nintendo UK's conceit that FPS split screen didn't make much sense, as you could always see your opponent's location, and to be fair once again, Turok didn't ship with one either. But imagine if Midway had the foresight to see just how popular the feature would become, as it would later propel GoldenEye 007, released only a few months later, to 8 million copies sold. What Doom 64 did do was get a mixed critical response. While magazines and certain fans heaped praise on the more horror-focused angle, the solid technical performance, and Hodge's haunting new musical score, there were just as many that felt the game did very little gameplay-wise to make itself special. Timing was also a bit of an issue. When it released in April of 1997, the franchise was already 4 years old, and the fact that this new version had no new gameplay tricks up its sleeve, other than environmental booby traps and shifting level layouts, shouldn't really be surprising that some fans were disappointed in its lack of innovation. And then, when you stacked it up against the detailed animations and crazy weapons of Turok Dinosaur Hunter, which launched the month before, and then GoldenEye later that November, Doom 64 very quietly just faded into the background, with many dismissing it as just another Doom that had no deathmatch. But even though it fell well short of Bond's 8 million copies, I have seen info that Doom 64 still did well for Midway, although I wasn't able to track down concrete numbers. But it is confirmed that Midway did immediately greenlight a sequel into production, which was ironically enough dubbed Doom Absolution. This was going to have a bunch of new levels and features, such as a full multiplayer mode that reportedly would have focused on 2-player action rather than 4. That might be explained, however, by the fact that they never got very far into its development, as Midway then officially cancelled it by the summer of 1997. Now this period is a bit murky, but it seems that Aaron Seeler and others were officially moved onto porting Quake, and that the remainder of the original Doom 64 team then started on Absolution. But once it became clear that it and the entire industry, let's be real, were now glazing Quake instead, Midway then decided to just cancel Absolution and move everyone on to the new hot shit. And then, for about 20 more years, nobody really talked about Doom 64, save for a few enthusiastic skeleton-based YouTubers who shall remain nameless.
Hey, I'm Derek, it's me, Derek!
But then eventually you started to see a shift, where people began looking back at the likes of Turok 1 or Hexen on the Nintendo 64 and realized that despite being, very simple and straightforward, Doom 64 held up a lot better in terms of its really solid technical performance and unique horror atmosphere. The advent of YouTube also saw mainstream fans being exposed to mods like those by Samuel Kaiser Villarreal, who worked on such projects as Doom 64 EX or the Absolution Total Conversion, which greatly elevated the presentation and performance and let players soak in the atmosphere with much smoother controls. And then, in a total reversal of its original, much more divided reputation, Doom 64 was entwined into the canon of modern Doom, with the 2020 remaster by Night Dive adding the Lost Levels, a new episode that linked everything together and was authored by Kaiser. So, wow, that is a very sudden turn of events. For what was once considered a forgettable spin-off that had become an afterthought amongst the likes of much flashier 3D fare, is now an integral part of a modern storyline, with legions of fans rediscovering its qualities decades after its release, which all makes for a rather rare positive end to a What Happened episode.
See? I told you, all this is awesome!
But if you know of any other games or movies that did not have a happy ending, let me know in the comments below or enter the UAC facility that is my social media. See you next time,
Doom Slayers!
And thanks for watching!